It's good to be back. We had actually the pleasure of presenting in April in one of the prior symposiums and symposia, and I'm delighted to be back presenting our second paper, kind of switching gears, looking at income, liquidity, and consumption response to the stimulus checks issued part of the CARES Act starting last month. My name is Robert Farrokhnia. I have the privilege of teaching at Columbia Business and Engineering Schools. I'm also the Executive Director of Advanced Projects and Applied Research at Columbia Business School. And my colleague, Dr. Pagel, who is a professor at the School of Business, and my co-authors. So for today, we wanted to give you a little bit of a background about our research paper. Which actually ongoing, and it's one of our series of papers we have already submitted or in planning or are in the works. Going to talk about our data and the methodology we used, share with you some of the more interesting results and findings, and lastly talk about the future steps and call for collaboration. So this working paper, as mentioned, is a collaborative effort by my co-authors, Scott Baker at Kellogg, myself at Columbia, Stefan Meyer at the University of Southern Denmark, Michaela, as I mentioned, another colleague at Columbia, and Konstantin and Analysed at Booth. If you're interested in the paper, you can look for it under the number, or sometimes it's typically easier just to look for it under the one of our co-authors' last name, and National Bureau for Economic Research. Now, the general objective that we wanted to achieve is looking at consumption behavior, or actually behavior of consumers as the pandemic is kind of pans out, and looking at the economic impact of it by looking at behavior, as I mentioned, as actual proxy, so for what people are thinking and how they are going about managing their lives, so to speak. And the ultimate goal for us is to be able to provide data-backed insight and policy recommendation for optimal impact, given the unprecedented nature of the crisis we're in, which is a combination of both a health crisis and a financial crisis, kind of unprecedented for modern times. Now, we, as mentioned, having access to data that provides an inside look into consumer financial behavior. We'd like to know how incomes are affected, how spending was rearranged but prioritized. And in the specific paper I'm presenting today, we wanted to be able to look at how users and households actually went on using the stimulus checks that they received starting middle of last month. And obviously for the policymakers to be able to implement effective and impactful change, it's important for them to know what's happening on the ground. Certainly, we appreciated the speed at which CARES Act was put into place. But at the same token, we wanted to make sure that we can showcase through our work if some of the underlying assumptions of the checks are correct and where it could be more optimized. And on the more academic angle, also looking at all these heterogeneous agents in our user base, which is representative of, we feel is quite representative of the U.S. population, which I'll discuss shortly, and how they are reacting and what the impact on the household level is, which eventually will translate into national. And also looking at the current crisis and current environment, seeing how it's different from prior crises, say 2008 or the one in 2001, and are these stimulus checks effective in achieving their goals? And the whole idea of whether these checks are truly meant to stimulate the economy or simulate the economy, given the fact that large sectors of the economy are shut down. Are these checks supposed to stimulate consumer spending and eventually recovery and growth, or whether at the moment they're just a stopgap measure to ensure that people can eat and pay rents and so on and so forth? More on that shortly. So having given you kind of a high-level understanding of what our objectives are, I would like to share with you some of the highlights of the data we're leveraging. So for the first time, and we are quite pleased to be the first team to be able to develop this type of research and insight, leveraging real-time spending and income data, both current and historic. This data is in the form of anonymized transaction level data from actual users. This is not aggregate data. We have a sample size of about 45,000 users that can go back as far as August 2016. And they are quite representative of the general population in the US, and they also include a good portion of lower income individuals, which is again kind of unique given the fact that most of the data that we have seen or typically tend to be skewed toward higher income also. And our data comes from a non-for-profit entitled Save Your Life, which is in the non-for-profit fintech, helping working families develop long-term savings habits and meet financial goal. Feel free to check them out at saveyourlife.org. And this data for us represents two major advantages, and that is, first and foremost, as I alluded to earlier, is high frequency, meaning that we have a lot of transactions happening and our data is quite up to date, and it's representative of the general population, as I alluded to earlier in my remarks. So we hope to be able to have a deeper look into how this pandemic is affecting users, especially those that are most impacted, low-income individuals. So just to get a sense of our distribution of our users in our sample, what I'm showing you here is a picture of every individual in our user base and how they are distributed throughout the US. As you can see, it kind of highly correlates with some of the higher population centers across the US and California, Northeast, and so on. And also in terms of income, if you look at the income distribution, you see that they also kind of correlate with the general income distribution across the country, in a sense that you see higher income individuals clustered in the Northeast and in California, relatively speaking, and more of a lower income in the South, just to give you some sample data points to think about. So we're quite pleased with the general outlook of the data, which, by the way, at the end I'll mention, I'd love to be able to open this data set for collaboration with other faculty, researchers, postdocs, PhD students across all Columbia schools. So keep that in mind. And across this data, this financial transactions data, we can observe a number of attributes directly, such as gender, age, zip code, income, which is both self-reported, and we can extrapolate using some of the data that we have, the actual income, sort of take-home income, if you will, and other attributes related to the actual transactions, the category, time, geolocation, and so on and so forth. Just obviously, no data is perfect, so we always have to do some data cleansing and cleaning and restructuring to some extent. And at this point in time, we can extrapolate about 90 attributes from the data sets and counting. Now that you have a general view of our objectives and the sample data we're working with, we'd love to share with you some of our findings and results. So at the top level, what we had looked at was how the stimulus checks were being used. As you may recall, to give you a quick refresher, the stimulus checks were part of the CARES Act, which went into effect middle of April, by which single households were to receive $1,200 of governmental checks for anyone earning from $1 all the way to $75,000. For those earning from $75,000 to $99,000, the amount would decrease, and anyone above $99,000 or so would not receive any checks. And for married households, just double the number. It turned out that at the time of the publication of the submission of our paper, rather, in general, about a third of the stimulus checks were spent. And the The rest at the moment, at the time rather, was kind of being saved, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So this was a little bit different than prior crises, where more of the money was spent up front. Here we saw more behavior toward saving as much of the check as possible with certain granularity, which I'll discuss in the following slides. And more importantly, the checks are primarily being used to catch up on, in general, what we call non-durable goods. Perhaps catching up on bills and rents, credit card bills accrued because of the stockpiling earlier in March and April. And we saw quite minimal expenditure on non-durable goods. And just to be clear, durable goods, non-durable goods primarily refer to consumer goods, things that you might buy and consume within a relatively short amount of time, like food and so on. Whereas non-durable refer to goods that may last much longer, like washing machines or cars and computers and so on and so forth. This will have some repercussions in terms of potential economic recovery, the shape of it, the form of it, the timing of it, and the impact in terms of the multiplier, which I'll talk about toward the end of my talk. So just to give you some actual data to look at, as I'm going to be throwing a lot of data at you, just like most academics do. Hopefully, you would not get bored by it. And some of it obviously makes sense, but having seen it backed by data, obviously, it's interesting. And for the rest, we can make certain extrapolations. For example, I mentioned that we saw very few non-durable good purchases. You could make an argument that perhaps because you don't need to travel very much, so you won't buy a car, or your car doesn't need fixing, or the fact you don't want a stranger come to your house and install a washing machine, and so on. But part of it, it certainly depends on other factors too. So in general, we saw a decrease in payroll income in general as the pandemic is playing out in each of these time frames. And other recurring income also as well. So we're kind of seeing this downward trend and downward pressure on income. And interestingly enough, governmental income is certainly increasing. So those that receive fairly regular paychecks from the government in terms of support, perhaps, saw a slight bit of an increase.
You have 2 minutes left.
Sure. And other income is also increasing. This bump you see here, these are tax refunds, and these are the stimulus checks. And we saw also income indicators decreasing, as a consequence for sure. And we saw no evidence, just like we had in our prior paper, about the difference in partisanship in terms of how income is being affected. So Democrats, Republicans are being affected, and independents, the same. We saw some evidence in terms of difference by education. So those on the lower educational level were impacted more often, although data should be interpreted with a little bit of caution at this stage. The same thing goes for gender. We did see that women were generally affected more than men. The data was evidence in terms of the gender pay gap and also the impact of the pandemic itself. As a consequence of the receiving the checks, we saw an increase in spending in checking account, and also the fact that people wanted to pay some of the expenses that occurred during the stockpiling. So you can kind of see how the expenditure of the checks occurred, how they are being drawn down. The same thing for ATM withdrawals. And if you were to zoom in for like 2 weeks prior or after the issuing of the checks, you kind of see this dramatic jump in expenditure and ATM withdrawals, which again was expected. We do see that people have delayed paying certain bills, including rent payments, which again will have lots of repercussion down the line. And more importantly, looking at how people are affected, it turns out that once again, based on our paper, liquidity matters the most, meaning that those who have least amount of savings are the ones that are affected the most and spend the most of the money. So that's kind of a quick gist of our findings. We are quite thrilled that for the first time we can have real data to enable such research, and being able to see what's really happening on the ground. We love to be able to understand the impact of the stimulus checks in light of the multiplier effects, and how these checks will eventually help or not help the economic recovery as they were intended. And our next steps, we love to be able to continue to analyze the expenditure, and we'll continue to monitor what's going on, and looking at also the other relevant data sources we can layer on top of this data. And as mentioned, we love to collaborate with as many other researchers at Columbia, so please feel free to reach out to us, to me or my any co-authors, and we love to work with you. And thanks again to all the organizers for the event for giving us a second opportunity to present. So thank you all. I'll pass the baton back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Robert. We will definitely have you and your colleagues back again. To start off the questions, if you were in charge of the federal government, how would you act to get the economy to recover?
Yeah, this is a question that we've been thinking about a lot, and looking at this data, it really drives point to home that behind every single data point is a human being, is a family that's being affected. And it kind of drives the point home how this, the proper implementation, optimization of this would matter. So we have seen a lot of people who got checks, number of people who got their checks and they haven't touched it. They just keep saving it, and some others who are quite desperate for it. So perhaps more granularity in how the checks were distributed, perhaps on a sliding scale, would have been advisable. That's my personal opinion. And looking at how those most affected, lower income, maybe perhaps would have been a little bit better to come up with a more optimized model in diverting some of the money toward unemployment benefits, so those who needed it would have benefited more directly, and so on. And we're looking at other countries who had other models. I'm sure best practices could potentially be transferable to the US.
Can you unshare your slides so
Sure.
Volker can share? And another question, what impact would you predict that the cessation of the extension of the unemployment benefits, which is scheduled, I believe, for July, is going to have?
Yeah, this situation seems to us quite dynamic. We're hearing talks of another round of stimulus checks. So I'm sure there are a lot of assumption that goes behind the scenes that we are certainly not privy to. But given the circumstances at the moment, we feel that having 30+ million people having their unemployment benefits cut down will have a dramatic impact on the potential recovery and reemployment. So I have a feeling that the policymakers would be looking at these issues closely, and there's a possibility of further extension is to be seen.
Margaret, if you unmute yourself, you can ask a question.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I have just noticed in listening to various conversations around Columbia and elsewhere that the push to reopen the economy seems to be built in some respects on the hope that there won't be a second wave or even a spike within the current outbreak. Can you say something about what second or third waves of this virus might do in terms of the economy?
Well, I am, to be clear, I'm not a health expert, so I would not venture to make an educated guess, in terms of the health impact. But certainly, I am of a belief that there has to be an optimal point in which you're still caring about the health of the general population, while in a very systematic and well thought out process, you could start reopening part of the economy without putting in population at risk, because the risk is being unevenly distributed. Those in certain segment of the economy that tends to skew to a lower income tend to be the ones that actually need to be on the premises, in places to at work, factories, and meat plants, and so on and so forth. So there has to be very careful consideration in that regard to ensure that the economic damage would not propagate further than what already is.